Good evening. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. On behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted you've joined us tonight for We Hold These Truths with our special guest, Dr. Jane Kamensky. Tonight's program is offered in partnership with Florida Humanities as part of a multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM Democracy Reignited, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. UNUM is funded in part by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with support from the Mellon Foundation and Florida Humanities. It is also part of By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a series of community-driven programs created by humanities councils in collaboration with local partners. This initiative was developed by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or its partnering organizations. If you are not familiar with the work of Florida Humanities and their partners, we're putting their web addresses in chat. Be sure to check them out. The chat window will be closed tonight, but you can ask questions at any time during the program by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't taken our pre-event survey yet, if you'll take just a moment to do so now, we're putting the link into the chat thread too. Your honest and anonymous answers will help the Village Square with a major nationally scoped research effort to better understand divisions in the United States. Even if you've done the survey before, we ask that you take a moment to do it again tonight. We are delighted to welcome streaming partners: USC Center for the Political Future, Bridge USA, Braver Angels, Living Room Conversations, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Listen First Project, Civic Health Project, McCourtney Institute for Democracy, Unify, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other podcast, Citizen Connect, Center for the Humanities at the University of Miami, Network for Responsible Public Policy, and our wonderful long-term local partners, the Tallahassee Democrat and WFSU Public Media. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Dr. Jane Kamensky is president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. We're dropping some links in the chat about her work so you can learn more. A leading historian of early America and the United States, she worked for 3 decades as uh, um, a professor and higher education leader, most recently as the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University. She brings to her work at Monticello a strong sense of civic purpose and a commitment to the ways that rigorous scholarship and compelling, honest storytelling help to build citizen capacity and revitalize the American experiment. Needless to say, we love that. Kamensky is the author or editor of numerous books, including A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley. Her most recent book, Candida Royale and the Sexual Revolution, and Blind Spot, a novel of art, politics, and passion in the American Revolution, with fellow historian Jill Lepore, a former commissioner of the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, which is a wonderful place. If you haven't been, please visit when you're in DC, and past trustee of the Museum of American Revolution. Kamensky is a member of the National Advisory Council of More Perfect and of the Executive Committee of National History Civics Initiative, Educating for American Democracy, among many other public history roles. From 2018 through 2025, she served as a scholarly advisor and on-camera expert for the Ken Burns documentary, The American Revolution. Jane, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
It has been, as I have shared with you, it's been such a joy to get to know your work. And I'm really excited about being able to share that tonight with our audience. So I want to start back before you were a historian. A younger Jane Kamensky, how did you find your life's work in history, and in particular in the history of the American Revolution?
So I would describe myself as an accidental historian. I'm a product of West Orange, New Jersey public schools, where our music program was great and our history program was quite terrible. Our social studies program was quite terrible. So I was a flutist in my youth and an orchestra admit to college, and conductor put their thumb on the scale, almost like being a linebacker, except with less in the NIL sweepstakes. And so music happened to get me to a university with a really strong history program. I majored in history because everybody was majoring in history, and I would love to think with you about how we get back to a moment where history is one of the most popular majors on a compelling college campus. But even then, I didn't think I was going to be a historian. I started on Wall Street
Fascinating.
as an investment banker, and in the mid 80s when everybody in my class was going to investment banks and consultancies. And when that didn't pan out, I did what my mother had told me, which was I had typing to fall back on, and I got a job in the typing pool at Columbia University. There was still a typing pool. Um, and
Wow.
I got free tuition as a member of Columbia's Clerical and Technical Union, and that's what put me back into graduate classes. And it was really when I found women's history as a field, which I had not studied at all as an undergraduate, that I felt that I was in the story. And that
Yeah.
sense of being a stakeholder in a different way than I had experienced eventually led me back into graduate school. Colonial and Revolutionary era, also quite accidental because it's where I found the best teaching and mentorship in my graduate program, and because as I began to dig into that early American history, I love puzzles, and I love working in a part of the past where people are enough like us that we can hear them and chime with them, but
Yeah.
so different enough from us that we can think about the ways that that things change. And so, uh, early America and the Revolutionary era have that combination of proximity and distance. And, in this anniversary year, really want to help a broad American public think about, wow, we're connected to these people who lived quite different lives, what initially feels like very long ago, but wasn't all that long ago. We just did a wonderful event at Monticello with the young adults novelist Laurie Halse Anderson, who's written a set of middle grades and YA novels set in the age of the revolution. And she said, it's just 4 human lifetimes, 250 years, right? So in geologic time, it's an eye blink, and want to think about that sense of, oh, it's a little different from us, but it's so close that got me into the business in the first place.
Well, that is just what a story. So what was your first job as a historian?
I was a really fortunate job seeker when I took my PhD in 1993, and one of the things that I always talk about in mentorship is the role of luck. I was lucky enough to land in a year that there were a number of history departments looking for early Americanists. The Mellon Foundation had predicted that a scholarly generation was retiring, and that universities were going to need to staff up in the
Mhm.
humanities. Prediction never came true, but the door cracked open enough for me. And my first job was at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. I believe from the attendees list that one of my former Brandeis colleagues may be on the Zoom tonight.
Wow.
And it was a fantastic place to start, because it's a small university with huge ambitions that made citizens of its young faculty very early on. Nobody ever said, you want to work on the revolution, we hired you to do Puritanism, or it was an easy place to zig and zag. The Boston area had a ton of public history resources for
Yeah.
people doing classroom teaching, and so a place where from the beginning taking students into applied historical settings was possible and even expected. So it was a great place to start. I taught there for 21 years.
Wow. And to me, when you're there in Boston, you can feel it. You
Yep.
just feel it all around you in a way that is pretty amazing. So fast forward all these years, and
More than I want to count.
you have this just extraordinary job as a historian, leading the work at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Tell us what it's like has been like both to start that job, but then also to continue your work in what is really a rarefied place.
So I was pulled to it. After Brandeis, I went to Harvard. I had a really good gig. I held an endowed chair in the history department at Harvard, um, and was really interested in connecting scholarly work with civic purpose. And I think that's a mission that higher ed is rediscovering now, but somewhat belatedly,
Hmm.
to be honest. And that was work that Monticello had been doing for decades. I hadn't spent a lot of time there. In fact, I hadn't spent any time there when a search firm reached out and said, here's a spec for a position. And a word that was all over the position spec was brave or courage. And that really appealed to me, to go to a place that saw a rigorous and honest and complex history
Hmm.
as the kind of courageous storytelling that could still inspire and help Americans to cohere in a time of division. Um, Exciting to start there 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, with an incredibly mission-driven workforce. It is, as I've described, to the marvel of former higher ed colleagues. It is a high trust, high accountability environment on the staff. And I think, people really have a sense of shared purpose to do everything we can to bring this site to life. Jefferson's remarkable life and legacy, and then the achievements and community struggles and perseverance of the hundreds of enslaved people who made that mountaintop plantation work. So it has a little bit the quality of a university and a little bit the quality of a seance. And somehow those two things put together. I don't know if you or anybody else who's watching grew up on the novel, The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, where they
I
get
do.
stuck in the Metropolitan Museum overnight and have this incredible access to cultural treasure. And sometimes when I'm there before dawn or after dusk, it feels a little bit like that. Sort of the good luck of being stuck in the museum.
That is um, just an amazingly vivid picture, and I'm going to apply for a job there tomorrow after hearing that. Really just extraordinary. And and can you, I mean, do you feel him there, the enslaved people? Do you kind of feel it sometimes?
So, many of my colleagues say that they do,
Hmm.
that they have a sense of presence. Uh, I am not that person. Like I am a creature of the Enlightenment. The ancestors do not speak to or through me.
Yeah,
Um, but I do have a sense of um, an almost sacred duty to this place and its people, right? Like
yeah,
I would say not presence in that woo-woo way, but
yeah.
proximity.
Mhm.
There's a section of the wall on the west front of the house where you can see, we're not encouraged to touch, but you can see the fingerprints of the people who made the bricks. And the people who made the bricks were enslaved, and the fingerprints are tiny. Brickmaking was a job that often went to children, right? Like it's that close. You can put your finger
Wow.
in the bricks that are made by enslaved children for the foremost philosopher of liberty, at least on the western side of the Atlantic. So that proximity to this most American of contradictions and everything that we can teach from it, everything that we can teach from it does feel very powerful.
Yeah. It does seem like, in particular because of the sort of the divisiveness in our civic environment now, it does feel like it's a place where courage matters, and it is also a sacred duty. So,
And
in my opinion,
also, I mean, I would
yeah,
say also, we have the gift of Jefferson, who is an incredibly broad-ranging and also incredibly complex figure. So I joke with colleagues who run the Lincoln Library and the Lincoln Boyhood Home. Um, Everybody loves Lincoln. They know what they feel about Lincoln. You're
yeah,
not, you're holding hands with somebody on their journey, but it's a journey that begins and ends in love. Jefferson has a much more vexed and complex reputation with ordinary Americans. And one of the things that that means to us, and that I think connects us to your work at Village Square, is our audience spans the entirety of the American political spectrum in about the proportions that we show up in the voting booth or in social media. And unlike the incredible work of bridging organizations, people haven't chosen to be together.
right.
It's a kind of natural experiment in the mixed spaces that we used to have before we went into our tribalized corners. And um, I like to feel that we're really making a difference by recognizing that for the gift it is. It's a challenge because not everybody speaks the same language or holds the same truths. But it also is an incredible gift um, to be charged with learning how to speak so that people of many different opinions, beliefs, and priors can listen.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that you see people roughly in proportional to the population. The truth is, they're just increasingly fewer and fewer spaces that are like that. And I mean, part of what we've seen over these past couple decades is that if you can put people in proximity with each other, all sorts of wonderful things do tend to happen. Humans have just this amazing capacity for understanding and reciprocal kindness when they're in proximity to people. So it's got to be kind of a rare space.
It is a rare space, and we want to do as much as possible with the relative, long time in museum terms. The dwell time on the mountaintop is about 2 to 4 hours for the average visitor, but short time in the span of a civic life. And want to think about how to create the highest impact and the most open channels possible from that time, so that, as with conversations like the ones that you sponsor, people carry it into their daily lives. We serve over 300,000 people a year from almost every zip code in the United
Oh,
States. So the multiplier effect, if they're talking to 10 people about something they've learned, and if those 10 people are talking to 10 people, you get to significant scale pretty fast.
I wonder if you've seen, I can't remember the name of it, but Myra Kalman's work. She's an illustrator,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
she did a whole series for the New York Times years ago, and one of them I think is all about Monticello, I want to say.
She did some Jefferson, some Franklin. They were published in a book after they had all run as panels.
Yeah, they're very very wonderful and compelling. So, in my personal opinion, you happen to be the author of possibly the best one sentence description and the best one word description I've ever heard about the American idea. So, the one sentence description that I'm going to get emotional, I'm sure, through this. I think that to believe in America, rooted in the American Revolution, is to believe in possibility. And then the one word you've used is leaky. So, how have you come to in the job that you have now, have you come to describe the American idea that's full of possibilities in more than one sentence? And then also, how is it leaky?
So the revolution is a period of tremendous rupture, right? And is one of the times in modern human history, maybe the first time in modern history, where people who have been born with one set of allegiances decide they're going to choose another, right? It's a nation founded on choices, which itself is an incredible innovation in the history of human government. And in that moment of people making choices en masse, right? 2.5 million Americans in the 13 rebellious colonies, all making decisions about what does this mean for me? Which side am I better on? Am I going to be the tallest blade of grass, or am I going to keep my head down? All of those are decisions about individual, family, community possibility. And so the country is born with people asking themselves, ordinary people asking themselves the question, um, where does my pursuit of happiness lie? And for those who decide that it lies with this almost certain to fail experiment that's calling itself these United States, they're running into that chasm, that open space, which is possibility. And I think one of the backbones of what came to be shorthanded as the American dream in the 19th century is the idea that this is a place where people make themselves up. That's the history of my family, right? Who got here in the late 19th, early 20th century. Two surviving brothers from a family that was wiped out in Central Europe by an epidemic with two nickels in their pocket and started working in the coal mines, right? My grandfather couldn't read, and I became a tenured professor at Harvard. That sense of the United States is a place where we don't take givens, we make them up. And in the film from which you're quoting that line, I make the point that that's true for people who didn't own themselves, right? Enslaved people are also placing bets, bets which sadly often turned out to be wrong and which they didn't have the political power to make true, certainly in 1776. But a nation born out of choices is a nation filled with possibility. And one of the things I'm hopeful about in the anniversary is that we investigate the world of the founding era enough that we can recover that shared sense of possibility. This is our inheritance, right? This is our American DNA. And the leakiness of the language of liberty goes with that, right? You put these ideals out into the world, even before the Declaration, with the language of the imperial struggle and what England owed its subjects. And it's not going to stay in the channels that the people who are running governments or publishing newspapers think limit the polity. It's not going to stay with property holders. It's not going to stay with white men. It's going to be everybody who is reading those newspapers aloud in a coffee shop and hearing it. We hear this in the letters of Caribbean planters who remain loyal to the crown when they are protesting the Stamp Act and writing to their corresponding numbers in the mainland colonies and saying, hey, be careful with this stuff at the dinner table because, people are listening. The first petitions by enslaved people using the language of liberty and tyranny to make their own case come in 1773 in New England. As soon as the Declaration is published, echoes of the Declaration show up in the language of petition. en route to the Declaration, think of Abigail Adams. Remember the ladies, right? No, nobody is writing these arguments for the ladies, but the ladies have a sense of their own patriotism and therefore eventually of their own citizenship. So I think the glory of the nation that the Declaration called into being is that our ideals are such a high ceiling that there's no way to lock the room, right? Like there's just a ton of headroom, and we're still fighting to realize those ideals, and that fight is perpetual in realizing this nation of possibility.
It seems like that's a category mistake we regularly make that somehow you get there.
Yeah, I remember so I have two sons now, 25 and 27, and the elder in his teen years described himself as the most woke person he had ever met. And mocked my patriotism and my sort of studied optimism about our future, and said, you're always talking about more perfect, like it's so perfect and you're going to make it even more perfect. And that's not what it means at all. It means that that's, the green light at the end of Gatsby's dock, and we're groping towards it, but we're never actually going to get there. The journey is the work.
Yeah. Um, and and just so much of the, I mean, the ideal is clearly so central to the spirit of every human being. That's why it couldn't stuck in the room, right? Is because you see it and you want it and you think, yes, that is what we need to do. But then, human nature and complex things get in the way, right from the beginning, pretty much, right?
Right. Well, one group's pursuits of happiness comes up against another group's pursuits of happiness. And there have been many times when we have treated happiness as a zero-sum game. But I think if American history shows us anything, it's that more is more.
Yeah. Um, so I came across a couple of one quote I had actually never heard before you said it, which is it's a Jefferson quote, "The ball of liberty has rolled around the world." And then I also came across a toast that Jefferson gave honoring Lafayette, that talks about how now that we've established the rights of self-government, rights which have blessed ourselves and will bless in their sequence all the nations of the earth. Was it really obvious at that point in time that it was rolling not just to populations of the United States that were enslaved and or not given the same rights as landed white men, but also across the world?
So when Jefferson says that about the Ball of Liberty, it's the 1790s. He's talking mostly about France, right? That
Yeah.
we've ignited the revolutionary spirit of a sister republic. Jefferson hangs with the French Revolution till the last dog dies. But certainly by the end of his life and the era of the Lafayette toast, they have seen adaptations of the Declaration in places where they're thrilled to see it, around Europe, around parts of Latin America, and places where they're horrified to see it, like in Haiti. But there is a contagion for liberty, using the language and premises of the Declaration, which I think is aspirational when Jefferson first says that in the 1790s. And by the time that he dies in 1826, has been realized to an extent that uh, that makes that, when they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, they mean exactly what you said, Liz, which is this is human nature, right? Like this is a law of the universe. This is not something that has to be proved scientifically. This is an indwelling law that people want liberty, and that government functions justly by consent. And Jefferson says very near the end of his life, when he's being invited to 50th anniversary celebrations in Washington, yeah, we've proven that the mass of human beings did not want to be ridden with boots and spurs. And so lives long enough to see that there are many others holding those truths self-evident as well.
And which really has continued through history.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful exhibition at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia called The Declaration's Journey that is looking at all the places around the world and in the country that take up that charge from the 1770s on forward, including ugly ones, right? The Confederacy bases its declarations of secession on the right of revolution in the Declaration of Independence. Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam quotes the Declaration of
Mm.
Independence. But so does King, right? King calls it our promissory note in the great "I Have a Dream" speech in the March on Washington. So uh, you know, it's still going. Um, we have an exhibition of all the places that the Declaration has been, quoted and affirmed at Monticello, and we often will have somebody saying, "Take that one out." Um, take out a Palestinian Declaration of Rights, or because it's too left, or take
Mhm.
out the use of this by Confederate states because it's too much of a blemish. They're all manifestations of that ball rolling around the world.
So, when they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," in the world around them, it wasn't self-evident at all. And you meant, I mean, in the world they lived in, right? The structures that existed around them. So, you mentioned the low likelihood that their revolution was going to succeed. I mean, really, the highest chance was that they were going to end up being hung, probably,
Our
as
lives, our
traitors to the
fortunes,
crown.
and our sacred honor is real, right?
Yeah. So was that were they just a reckless group? Or they
Well,
just believed this so deeply that they were willing to stake their lives on it?
so let me back up and say, though their world is not full of social and political equality, Jefferson means this, and the rest of the committee and then Congress affirms it as a statement of human capacity in the state of nature, right? This is before entering into governments, everybody is equal. So they would not have heard the contradiction that we hear. They would not have heard the contradiction that the people who said, "Give me some of that," heard from the get-go.
Yeah.
They were not, this is another kind of leakiness, is they were talking about the pre-political world, and almost immediately people are saying, "No, I want this in the political world now. I want my life, liberty, and happiness." Um, do they believe it passionately? I think they believe it passionately, and um, uh, it helps that Congress is very young, right? The average age of, or what I would consider young, the average age of Congress is 40, and Franklin, Caesar Rodney, a few others are really pulling up the average. Jefferson is 33 when he
It
is the
was just
primary author
amazing.
of the Declaration. So I think there is a an intemperance in Congress, uh, born out of the actions of the king and parliament, right? Like they have a set of conflicts that is very difficult to manage at a 4,000 mile distance, and that is really poorly managed just by the character of the king and his ministers, who, if you want to have an imperfect analogy, believe in a kind of domino theory of the case, right? As goes Boston, So eventually goes Jamaica and Ireland, and wouldn't that be a mess?
Hmm.
When letting Boston break off into the city state that it was already functioning as would have been a perfectly practical thing to do. By the time the Declaration is written, um, Bostonians, New Englanders, and the committees of correspondence that the Sons of Liberty have established all up and down the Eastern Seaboard have persuaded a large number of leaders that Boston's fight is everybody's fight.
Yeah.
And so they are making a brave life and death decision because they feel that the stakes are life and death. And of course, by then people have been dying for um, 15 months, right? Since April of 1775, they're in a war. So they're young people with high political ideals, in some ways thin skins about the rights of British subjects that have been denied to them. And they're in wartime, a time that calls for decisiveness.
Uh, so, so talk to us about the primary author of that leaky idea, and as you've come to know him in your scholarship at Monticello, including what John Meacham called his epic contradictions.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson's highs are higher than almost anybody we can think of, and his failures are profound. And to me, the third leg of that stool is, and he knows it. So he gives us both a conflicted historical hero and an acutely self-conscious one. If we think, as my Harvard colleague Vincent Brown used to say, history is a series of predicaments, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to believe that just because we're alive and they're dead, they had easy choices. Jefferson was acutely aware of those predicaments, including his own, and yet could not extricate himself from them. It makes him a fascinating figure to think with. So when he says all men are created equal, he means it, and he means every single person in the world. And when he looks out at Monticello, he's looking at predominantly Black space where the people who are there, as he put it, labor for his happiness and depend entirely on him to define their being. Um, he thinks enslavement is wrong. He begins saying that publicly in his summary view of the rights of British America, before the Second Continental Congress. He puts a 168 word anti-slavery paragraph in the draft of the Declaration, which Congress then just slices every word out. So he considers it a moral abomination. And he considers abolition to be a practical impossibility. And thinking about how those two things go together, right? In some way, so he thought of the West as a safety valve, right? That people moving west in a growing continental nation was what was going to allow this moral abomination to recede and resolve, right? Slavery would be a smaller and smaller portion of the population. People wouldn't have to really live together. Maybe we would send people, quote unquote, back to Africa, place where people of African descent had not been for generations, sometimes centuries. But in fact, the spread of the Cotton Kingdom meant that the move west was the absolute opposite of a safety valve. By the 1820s, he realizes that he is stuck, right? As he says after the Missouri Compromise, we have the wolf by the ears. We can neither tame him nor safely let him go. He has a great confidence in the American generations yet unborn. And when people write him and say this, he says, like, you're completely right. Go solve it. And I'll be cheering you from the grave, basically. So he has some kinds of courage and other kinds of profound limitation on his vision. And in that way, I think is like all of us, right? Like if a question that people ask themselves at Monticello is, how do I live my values and where do I fail? And what would it take to transform that failure into action? One of the things he says about it in his many private and public utterances wrestling with slavery is, I think it will take a transformation in public opinion in order to affect that change, which in a democracy, of course, is exactly right.
Yeah.
Affecting mass change in a democracy requires a change in public opinion. Um, he did not change public opinion when he was president of the United States or vice president of the United States. So his quandary is our quandary in very real ways. And I think if Jefferson prompts people not only to look at him, but to look at themselves, at ourselves, he will have made an even more profound contribution than the many he made during his life.
And maybe that is in some ways sort of part of why we're so drawn to him as a topic and why we spend a lot of time sort of given how many years ago that was. We talk about
Yeah,
it
I
with
mean,
this.
I think the anthropologist Clifford Geertz used to say such and such is good to think with. And
Hmm.
Jefferson is good to think with. Um, you know, I don't think we should be looking up at him on our knees. I don't think we should be looking down at him from a secure and lofty perch. I think trying to look eye to eye with him, we'd have to stand a little tall. He was, after all, 6'2", um, uh, is fair to his way of understanding the role of the founders in their world. By the time he died, people had begun to venerate the founding generation. They didn't call them founding fathers until 1916. But yeah, Warren G. Harding
I
started
did
it.
not know that.
Yeah. But starting with the cult of Washington, even at the end of his life, but especially after his death, people had begun to venerate men of the founding generations, and when they would write to him and say, oh, Mr. Jefferson, if we could only have, a piece of your one true cross, he would say, I was just one of a band of people who were fighting for the same cause. And uh, those times were not so different from these times, except we have the benefit of their experience and they didn't have the benefit of ours. So I think trying to recover the whole world building required to understand him in situ, I like to think it's what he would have wanted, in addition to being valuable to us as thinkers about the American present and future.
That actually reminds me of the fact that he had a bust of Hamilton that he regularly looked at, and you'd walk by, and what did he say? Something.
So, in fact, we had this bust up on a bracket in the wall in the entrance hall, and we've just reinterpreted it closer to what we know was originally in the house, which was in a on top of a truncated column, so about human height, in the entrance hall, facing a bust of Jefferson. And he said, so that we may be opposed in death as we were in life. He also has a bust of John Adams overlooking his bed. And he and Adams were both, bosom friends and compadres in the revolutionary struggle, and then political enemies for a long period in the 1790s and early 1800s through Jefferson's presidency. So he liked to be surrounded by the chorus of disagreement. One of the other artifacts in the first floor of the house that fascinates me is he had what at least purports to be a death mask of Oliver Cromwell, the Republican leader and then tyrant of the English Civil War. I think an object lesson in republics can turn tyranny
Yeah.
too. Surrounding himself with things that must have caught him up short on a day-to-day basis rather than a kind of comfortable gauze wrapped romance.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Seems like something that I wish we would re-embrace
Well,
as a
I don't you
society.
think, I think everybody I talk to in the bridging movement says that there is enormous demand, right? That there are many organizations proceeding in many forms of the same work, and too many calls to speak and listen to actually satisfy them all. I think there really is a hunger to
Yeah.
recover a world in which we can disagree better, as the National Governors Association effort of a couple years back had it. We began working on it in early 2024, launched last spring a special tour about political disagreement in the founding called Founding Friends, Founding Foes, that uses the Jefferson-Adams relationship as its spine. And it's become so popular that we had to put it on extra times every day. It became very quickly our most highly rated tour. And people who have taken the tour and taken after action surveys, and like you, were a high survey organization, have said that they felt comforted to know that there had been division in the past,
Hmm.
and people had found a way to manage it, and they felt more eager to find somebody who disagreed with them to talk to.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Yeah, when we started, there were maybe four or five organizations that did this work. Now there's over 500, and that was probably a year ago. So to me, it's very American, that sort of welling up.
Yeah.
Something needs to be done, so I guess I'm going to do it. People stopping what they're doing in their lives to create bridge building opportunities for fellow citizens. So I am going to remind everybody that you can put questions in boy, time has flown. Put questions in at the Q&A, and we will get as many of them to Jane as we can. I'm going to give the first question to Dr. Nasheed Majouin, who is the executive director of Florida Humanities. Is the perfection of our union our ability to fix what is broken over time? Noting that the world changes over time, people evolve, and we always have the power to change the lens.
Yeah, I do think the ability to revise ourselves and our form of government is super important. And of course, one of the challenges that our democracy faces right now is that the Constitution has become essentially unamendable since the mid 1970s. Feels like the 1770s, but it was only the 1970s when we had the last substantive amendment to the Constitution. However, state constitutions continue to be amended, right? Communities gather to rewrite their own norms. Elections take us back and forth. I do think our ability to revise is a genius of our government, and is also a core democratic skill, right? So uh, at Monticello and in many other civic learning institutions, we think about content, skills, and dispositions or virtues. The content we're teaching is, history of the founding era, through Jefferson and all of the people who lived and labored on the mountaintop. The skills include, I need to be able to change my mind. I need to hold two competing truths in my head at the same time without feeling a need to say, no, he was really this versus that. I need to be curious and to listen. So not only revision at the level of government, but self-revision ought to be a kind of core virtue for people who want to participate effectively in a constitutional democracy. We get it wrong all the time. At our best, we have had a terrific ability to admit that and learn from it and move forward.
Yeah, I sometimes I worry that we're missing the skill of humility. I wonder if you see that as playing a role in our work as citizens.
I do. I think empathy and humility are two core virtues of historical inquiry, right? And the humility is to realize that nobody, first of all, to realize, and it seems so intuitive, but it really isn't, that they didn't know how it was going to turn out, right? Nobody knows the consequences of their actions in the way that we do with the perfect clarity of hindsight. So empathy with the predicaments of the past, which was their present, right? Reminding ourselves that our past was their present, and then the humility to realize that just as they got it wrong, we will get it wrong too. We have gotten it wrong. I have been wrong in the past. I've been wrong on this conversation, and I will bring off and be wrong again tomorrow. So I think having that humility grants us a little grace, right? Like if we granted our neighbors and ourselves the grace that we ought to grant people who lived in other times and places, we would be much healthier.
So I want to make sure that you mentioned the Founding Friends, Founding Foes tours. I want to make sure to ask you what's happening in this 250th year at Monticello.
Thank you for that. So, we're trying to approach this anniversary year as a time of beginning, as well as as a culmination of the first quarter millennium of the American experiment. And I like to think about the arc of the next 15 years, which is what separates the Declaration from the Bill of Rights. So we will celebrate the 250th of the Bill of Rights in 2041. And all of our efforts are centered around what do we want the capacities of our visitors and the people who engage with our content to be by 2041, right? Like, how can we be programming visitor experiences and special events that allow people to find those virtues and capacities of self-government. So Founding Friends, Founding Foes tour is one of our signature offerings for the anniversary. We'll probably keep it going because it's been very popular. We're doing a program both tied to and independent of that tour called Feast of Reason, which is a facilitated conversation that follows an arc of dialogue format where you go from easier things to harder things and back to easier things, building trust and familiarity with your interlocutors along the way. It's a really good way for strangers to break down walls between them and to talk about things as light but profound as when someone asks you where you're from, what do you say and why? Or describe a favorite food from your youth and the memories that it evokes for you, to what is a moment that you have felt proud of the United States, and what is a moment when you have felt less than proud of the United States. And that's a program that we do led by Monticello staff, but it's also a game in a box that you can buy at our shop. And my fantasy of this Feast of Reason program is that it will make people excited about the disagreement over Thanksgiving dinner. And then, we're doing a number of things that celebrate and wrestle with the promise of the Declaration, including an effort called Declaration Book Club, which is an online educational resource now being used by both adult groups and school groups in all 50 states and 6 countries outside the United States. And we're soon to launch in early May a book project with a press partner in San Francisco called Declare, a Civic Gospel of art, poetry, and essays inspired by the Declaration.
That is beautiful. Um, I love your high aim to make Thanksgiving dinner something that we look forward to. Um, and actually became incredibly intrigued by uh, Jefferson dinners early in our journey at the Village Square, enough that we started a project and we invited people to have Jefferson dinners. And that actually culminated in, before your tenure, we went to Montalto. Is that how you say it?
Yep,
The high
the high
mountain
mountain.
at Monticello. And we had, 7 or 8 uh, Jefferson dinners with diverse civic leaders, some from Charlottesville, some from people flew in all over the country. They've every time I've participated in a Jefferson dinner, it feels transformational. Tell us about why. What
So
was
and Feast of Reason is basically the retail version of the Jefferson dinner. I mean, I think when you gather around a table and there are multiple routes to thinking of these as Jeffersonian dinners. One is the dinner table bargain that is celebrated in Hamilton and which really was fundamental to the future of the United States, locating the capital in Washington in concession for other key trade-offs. His granddaughter said that gathering around his table was a feast of reason, and that he often gathered unlike minds. And I think we are curious people, and it's really good to talk to people who disagree when there's enough scaffolding to make people feel comfortable feeling brave. I hate the word safe, and I try never to use it unless there is actually a physical threat to my
yeah.
safety. But for people to feel comfortable sharing themselves, knowing that there's somebody who thinks very differently from them. This is one of the great things about being human, and it's one of the great things about the dazzlingly diverse nation of the United States is that though we have sorted ourselves into tribes by education level, by zip code, where there's often now little political variation. In a moment where, and Liz, you and I were talking about this yesterday, political identity is now one of the most stable identities in American life, which of
Hmm.
course is very dangerous. Um, but we're an incredibly diverse people. We come from all over the world. We worship all gods and no gods, as Jefferson would say. We all want a better future, but we have wildly divergent ideas of what exactly that means. And experiencing that human variety and learning from it is joyous. So that's what sends me home from work every day, thinking we're going to be okay.
Yeah. I'm I'm so glad to hear you say that you feel that. And in fact, I guess I'm going to throw in a question now from the audience if I can find where it was. Is is there anything about the turmoil we're going through now that you see as being potentially positive?
I think that that's a really tough question. I mean, uh our headwinds can be our tailwinds, right? That uh the turmoil we're going through now is what we're going through now. And it has nourished a spirit of um community and experimentation in different ways in different parts of the United States, right? Like the moment of the American Revolution, a moment when masses of people are dissatisfied with the status quo is a moment where there is a lot of possibility. I would like to have that possibility without spasmodic political violence.
Yeah.
But I do think the kinds of social experimentation you're seeing in the bridging movement, in the civic renewal movement, right? Round about 2010, civics was taught hardly any place, and now we've got mandates of different kinds in, I believe, 46 or 47 states. So I think people are digging deep. I think a moment of this kind of turmoil is one where people are asking themselves, you know, what does it take? What can I do? So if it can prompt re-engagement and the quest for the learning that we need to steer a democracy, right? We have an incredibly demanding form of government. Monarchy is super easy. You don't have to ask any questions when you wake up in the morning. You don't have to devise any answers. It's very stable, right? It just passes down through the male line, rarely through the female line. We have a demanding form of government where each new generation has to take the reins. This is why Jefferson believed so profoundly in citizen education as a goal. And we have to make sure that they're trained to do so. And I do think that this moment is causing a lot of folks to say, wait, we're not up to the job. What's it going to take? Some, loud but relatively small constituencies saying, um, well, maybe democracy is not the form of government that best secures human happiness. I think there are many more of us in what More in Common calls the exhausted majority who
Hmm.
are now willing to do the hard work. So people rolling up their sleeves as a silver lining, I do feel like
Yeah.
that's happening.
Yeah. I think you're right. Here's sort of maybe a related question. What's the number one action we can take as a community to redirect the current direction the country is headed?
Um, I think asking each other questions, you know, so Educating for American Democracy, the K-12 civic framework that Liz mentioned that I was part of before, um, takes coalition building to be one of the key lessons of the past and the key tools for the future. So I would say, and Bridging Movement is doing this in some really successful ways. I'll call out one in a minute. Finding a problem that you want to work on and then finding the largest group of people, most politically diverse group of people possible who can work on just that problem. Right. If it's about cleaner water in your city, I don't care what they think about abortion. I don't care what they think about
Mm.
mail-in voting. As long as they're going to work on this clean water initiative with me, we're all in the tent. Finding provisional coalitions to move something small and local forward, and through that, building the political skills to figure out, well, what's the next bigger thing? A group that's been doing this really brilliantly in Colorado is a civic renewal group called Warm Cookies of the Revolution.
Oh, yes, we are
Um,
big fans. We're actually going to
and
be with Evan, the founder, in a couple weeks.
and it's that spirit of we're just gonna we're just gonna solve a problem. And
Mhm.
then, maybe it's not a city problem, maybe it's a countywide problem or a five county problem. Maybe it's a bigger set of issues. Then maybe we just become people who are good at solving problems. And I think
Yeah.
that's the way they've scaled. And all of the people who have participated in any of their work have heightened capacity to do any kind of democratic work, small
Yeah.
d democratic work.
Yeah. And our experience with when you do that, when you work side by side with someone that you wouldn't naturally be with in another circumstance, you see their good intention, you see their humanity. So much of our problem isn't that we disagree with each other. That's baked in, right? That's a feature, not a bug. It's that we see each other, we've dehumanized each other, we've vilified and demonized each other when you don't actually know anyone who disagrees with you.
And of course, and this is something that is quite different from the founding era, um, that demonization is a business model
Yeah,
for social media and other forms of competition in the attention economy. So I guess that's another small goal is to curate or reduce your feed such that we try to do these things living in the world and not in the simulacrum of the world that feeds us these versions of each other that are not true and that
yeah,
we know that we don't want.
yeah. So you mentioned before talking about your son, and I've seen you say in talks, the quote is, "The vital center of American politics isn't holding for young people." Uh, that's also been our experience. I wonder if you could say more about what you see and how you think about the challenge ahead.
So I just read today a briefing from made by us on this very question, and the numbers of younger millennials and Gen Z who say that it's either very important or essential to live in a democracy is below, it's like herd immunity, right? It's below the herd immunity threshold that you need
Mm.
to sustain a democracy. And I think there are, I guess I'll point to three key reasons behind that. One is that we have not served them very well, right? Like they have, somebody sent me a social media posting the other day. If you were born in the 21st century, the United States has been at war 100% of the years that you have lived. Um,
Wow.
100% of the elections you remember have been cast as an existential struggle between good and evil. You can't afford a house. The sense of of an American dream that will sustain has not been there. So I think they've confronted terrible conditions. I think they've confronted them with relatively poor skills because we haven't taught civics widely enough or deeply enough to give them a sense of agency in the face of these projects. And then I think a thing that's really hard to figure out is people who are my age, I'll soon be 63, have not figured out a way to both lead and follow. So I think there's a lot of reflexive, we need youth voice. Um, yes, and youth needs our voices, speaking candidly about our hopes and dreams and what we want to transmit. So it is a real predicament. When I talk to Gen Z audiences about the occasion of possibility that is this anniversary, there is widespread skepticism. Um, I think it all comes out of grave concern about
Mhm.
their future and a sense that the tools they have, they either don't know how to use or that they're too, whatever the hammer is softer than the wall.
Yeah. It also, I mean, maybe it's also a lesson that you learn a little later in life about how we're all flawed, and is sort of the humility comes along a little later. I remember I felt like I knew everything.
Sure,
And
right. It's the Mark Twain quote when I was 16. I couldn't believe that my father didn't know anything. And when I was 21, I couldn't believe how much he had learned in 5 years. Um, I also, I do think that's not just the moral confidence of youth flaw. I think it's a teaching challenge, right? That if we model in our classrooms, whether that's the family dinner table or the historical site or the library or a K-12 or college classroom, if we model in our classrooms that sense of humility and empathy, a satisfaction with imperfection.
Mhm.
If we're not teaching history, for example, in the was this guy good or bad? I
Yeah.
a colleague from another university wrote to me recently and said, I'm teaching a course called Heroes and Villains in History, and I'm sharing with you a video a student of mine made about how Jefferson is a villain. And, it was Thomas Jefferson, bad man. And he had the kind of demon eyes of Dark Biden. And
Wow.
I said, I don't think about people that way in the past or the present
Mhm.
or the future. I think our teaching moves have something to do with the way that young people frame their world.
Yeah. Great insight. You mentioned Made by Us. It's a wonderful organization. I am
Yes, it
popping
is.
the link in the chat window. So as I prepared for this, I came across you talking about a story about a student of yours from Concord, the site of the first Revolutionary War battle. Could you tell us that story?
Yeah, so I taught the American Revolution for the first time in my career in the winter of 2017. At Brandeis, there was an eminent senior historian who had taught it the whole time, and I got to Harvard, and Harvard hadn't had anybody teach it in 40 years, which is a whole other story. And when I framed that syllabus, I thought all about the scholarly cutting edge and not at all about the civic needs of my students. And there was a kid in the class named Daniel, who was a Concord and Lexington reenactor. That was why he took the class. I think people in his family he might have had people who fought in 1775, but I know generations of his family had been reenactors. And at the end of the class, I did a metacognitive essay exercise with each of them where I interviewed them about their big takeaway from the course. And I asked them at the beginning, one-on-one, something as an icebreaker. And my icebreaker for him was, what are you going to do with your reenactment group over the summer? And he said he had quit. And I said, and he was teared up. And I said, what do you quit? Um, he had wanted to bring a musket demonstration to the class. Like he was really proud of this. And he said, yeah, well, what I learned from what we read in your class was this kind of historical mythology is all lies. And I realized that there was a tension between the approach of much of the scholarship and the need of my students, but really of all individuals for belonging, right? Like the last thing I wanted to do in the whole world was teach the American Revolution in a way that subtracted from this kid's civic life. And it was a real wake-up call for the way I taught the class. I first shifted the capstone project to be a civically engaged project where they took their book learning and thought about the curricular needs of a school or the interpretive needs of a public history site. And eventually it was that desire to connect scholarship to civic impact that led me to Monticello.
So you've said that as a people we need to rediscover patriotism. Why?
Um, because, and here I'm quoting on the great Atlantic essayist George Packer, people will belong to a nation, right? Like it is the largest solidarity that most of us can imagine. And It is a kind of natural and unthinking attachment to be part of a we. And um, what we get to shape as educators and thought leaders and ordinary civic participants is what that belonging means. So you can't wave it away. You can't say, like, you're not going to have feelings about belonging to a nation. What we can say is, what are the things patriotism can consist of in a constitutional democracy like the United States, world's oldest continuous constitutional democracy? When de Tocqueville comes to America in 1832 and is just fascinated as a creature of, now neo-imperial France by this bumptious experiment in self-government. He says, um, God, people wrestle with this ridiculous new country all the time. They criticize it from one end to the other, and yet they love it. And he calls this reflective patriotism, or that's one of the key translations of the concept that, this is he believes a kind of unique American form of attachment to the nation is that in this nation of possibility that requires its own continual choosing, people are always holding its feet to the fire. That reflective patriotism is what Educating for American Democracy calls for as the attitude that shifts learning into civic action, civic agency. I think there will be many different answers to what patriotism means in the United States, but I think none is really not an option. I fly the American flag 24 hours a day outside my house, which I believe is wrong. I know I'm supposed to fold it up at night. Um, uh, because nobody else can tell me that they own my flag.
Mhm.
And I do think I've joked in a number of settings that the left has a patriotism problem, the right has a democracy problem. These problems are related to each other, right?
Yeah,
Those of us in the center and left of center were more full-throated about a love of country and a humble wish for its success. Those on the right would be more trusting of constitutional democracy as a way to solve our problems.
beautifully said. That is our experience as well. Um, and you also said some magic words for us, which is de Tocqueville, and we've sort of traveled along this road with Mr. Jefferson, but then also with Alexis de Tocqueville and his his sense of that surprise, sort of that Americans now with this democratic republic that we were responsible for were forever forming associations. And our experience has been as kind of the national divide has gotten worse and worse over the couple decades we've been in existence at the Village Square. It's been a strange experience to watch the division get so bad and to have something very different happening in our lived experience here in our location. So we really believe in the idea that citizens have to be grounded locally for this to work. I've heard you say some pretty interesting things about how being engaged locally was a different thing. It was new, and partly because of distance.
Right. Well, at the time of the founding, the word nation is used nowhere in the Declaration, right? It's founding a confederation of states, almost like the European Union. United States is plural until the Civil War, these United States, and not the United States. And it's very hard to get a sense of what the national government is, right? The national government is the post office
Hmm.
for generations. Jefferson himself thinks at the time of writing the Declaration, really where it's at is the Virginia State Constitution, right? That these local and colony-wide, then Commonwealth or statewide institutions of government are going to be the most important. Jefferson remains a devolutionist for his entire life. So people's political horizons were their communities with maybe a newspaper to give you an aperture into things that were going on elsewhere in the country. I think one of the challenges of the now is that media ecosystem and information economy, attention economy that we were talking about a few minutes ago, um, keeps calling us back to the national, right?
Yeah.
You just cannot avoid thinking about the President of the United States and his administration. Um, we didn't actually grow up that way, even in our lifetimes,
Hmm.
that there was this constant reversion to the highest level
Yeah.
of our belonging. So I do think the state and local are incredibly important, and hopefully the in person, right? The ability to be together in space and be sort of cueing off each other, feeding off each other. That's what's magical about the Jeffersonian dinners is you're reading facial and body language
Yeah.
and breaking bread.
Yeah. That definitely matters. We agree with that. So I want to ask Christine if she can pop the link to. We're meeting with a bunch of local practitioners that include Warm Cookies of the Revolution, and actually, it's supported by Karsh Institute at UVA for Democracy in a couple of weeks with a lot of people who are doing that kind of work that we're really inspired by. So we are running dangerously short on time here. So a question from the audience: what do you think the framers would be most worried slash horrified about if they um, saw us now?
Well, I think they would worry greatly about our division, right? The devolution into faction and the ability of the government to manage faction was an element of profound concern across the political spectrum. I think Jefferson and those of his party would be very worried about the concentration of executive power and the weakness of legislative power. Um, I think the lack of an ethos of national service is related to both of those things and would also be concerning, right? Like the founding generation broadly defined, right? Whether you were a abolitionist or a worker in your church association or somebody who served in your state house or in Congress or in the military had an ethos of service, a sense that you owed something to the preservation of this experiment. And I think the focus on rights out of sync with obligations would likewise be concerning. I think that education was the answer that they came up with for many things, right? And efforts like the bridging movement, like the civic renewal movement that we see at all ages in most states would be buoying. And they were imperfect too, but they bequeathed something to us, and we need to make ourselves worthy of that inheritance.
So our very first Village Square program 2 decades ago opened with me reading some passages from historian Patricia Nelson Limerick's piece in the New York Times called Dining with Jeff. It was a eulogy to both her husband and to Jefferson and Adams. It opens up with founding a democracy, rather like living in a democracy, can be very tough on a friendship. Um, tell us the story of Jefferson and Adams.
So Jefferson and Adams are together at the moment of creation, right? The primal scene of the country. Adams hands the pen to Jefferson, I think knowing that he himself is too toxic to be the primary author, and that a Virginian should do it. And tactically, for getting the thing through Congress and through the battles of the 1770s and early 1780s, they are very much aligned. And then as political parties form in the United States in the late 80s and 90s, they find themselves on opposite sides. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican hyphenated party, and Adams as a Federalist. They run against each other twice, which is never a great recipe for friendship. Adams wins the first one, and before the 12th Amendment, that means Jefferson is his vice president, which is even a worse recipe for ongoing civic friendship. And then Jefferson wins the second time, and Adams takes his toys and goes home to Massachusetts. They don't speak for almost um, 11 plus years. Just absolute dead silence. And on the 1st of January of 1812, Adams, having had a campaign from Dr. Benjamin Rush, the great abolitionist and statesman of Philadelphia, um, takes it upon himself to write to Jefferson. And it's a model of the moves of civil discourse with unlike-minded people. He doesn't say, "Gosh, we've had a terrible falling out. I'm so sorry." He says, "I'm sending you two pieces of homespun from Massachusetts. I'm curious to see what you think of them. How's your family?" Jefferson writes back at some length. The pieces of homespun are actually works on rhetoric by John Quincy Adams. They're two books, but they don't arrive with the letter, so Jefferson thinks he's sending him some cloth. And they take up this late life correspondence where they're incredibly generous to each other, but also incredibly rigorous. Neither of them ever changes their mind. And the purpose of civil discourse is not to make you change your mind, it's to make you share your mind. And then figure out what the small place is that you can work on together. So we have that correspondence. It's about 4-1 Adams. There's one really poignant moment in the correspondence where Adams says, "How many letters do you get every year?" And Jefferson says, like, "Well, I just counted last year, it was 1,267." And Adams says, like, "Oh, I got like 90." Um, they have all of their predilections and infirmities, as old men sharing themselves with each other. But there's something about their candor, their earnestness, their openness to each other, that I just find so incredibly exemplary, and that has made it beautiful to program a tour about them, even though Adams in physical personhood was never actually in Monticello. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it was never there. And then they have an ending that is too good to exist in fiction. They die within hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the United States on July 4th of 1826, which their eulogists treat as prophetic. Um, they each die hoping the other survives. Adams's last words are said to be, Jefferson lives, which he doesn't. And they share, in this late correspondence from 1812 to 1826, the conviction that their belief in the American project is just more profound than their divisions about this route versus that route, even though they firmly stick to their own routes.
Yeah. So I am going to, before we close tonight, I'm going to ask one question after this. I wanted to ask if you could click on the link that we're putting in the chat window to complete the post evaluation. It's not all sciency unless we get a pre and a post. Um, and you describe our country, Jane, as having been born in choice, a choice we have to keep making. What do you take from the story of Jefferson and Adams, or just or anywhere, um, how we start making that choice a little bit more intentionally? What did they show us how to do?
Start small. Right. It's the ingredients you've said already, assume good intentions, until proven otherwise. They always, in this correspondence, they start with family. I've never yet met the person, however violently they disagree with me, whose hope for the future is that their children live worse lives than they have.
Yeah.
Um, Start with the places where common ground is easy to build, and then see how far you can go toward anything, and work on that thing. And don't take it as your mission to prevail so much as to keep the conversation going. There's a moment in a letter from Adams in 1813 where he's doing he does a whole how can you believe this? It's the War of 1812, right? Like, and he's saying to Jefferson, how absurd is your optimism now? And then he says, you and I ought not to die before we explain ourselves to each other. And I think that's the work of democracy. It's the work of explanation, even before it's the work of coalition building and persuasion. So I think that generosity and explanation is something that reading those letters we're doing on May 2nd. There's a lovely three-person play that's Jefferson, Adams, and Abigail. Hearing those words, there's a wonderful paperback edition of the letters. It's chicken soup for the constitutional soul.
Oh, that's wonderful. I just realized I missed a question that I really wanted to ask you. What can we accomplish in an anniversary year like this one?
So anniversaries make memories, right? And you and I are on our second big one, right? We remember the
Yeah.
bicentennial. I've told my young charges, think about what the memory is that you want to plant, because you are probably lucky enough to get another one in 50 years. I won't be. And use it to build shared knowledge, and also shared institutional structures. So I think the bridging movement can be a great thing that grows in this anniversary moment. In the bicentennial, we founded an awful lot of state and local historical organizations that still endure. A significant plurality of the historical organizations that still endure were founded in the bicentennial. An anniversary by itself is nothing, right? It's a calendar trick. But it is an opportunity to plant community and make memory. I think it's a great occasion to investigate the question of patriotism and what binds each of us to the nation, which means what binds us to each other.
So you have made me well up with tears a number of times this evening. I had to hold it together to get through.
Ah,
But I do want you to know that for me, this hour and a half has been a bucket list item. It really is a true honor to have had this conversation with you. I feel like we've got quotes galore that we'll want to share of the just the profound wisdom that you've shared with us, and it has just been a true joy, Dr. Kamensky.
well, thank you so much for inviting me into the conversation, and into all of your living rooms, and come see us on the mountaintop.
Please do. I can assure you it's an incredible life experience if you haven't been. Thank you. On behalf of Florida Humanities and the Village Square and our streaming partners, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good
Thanks.
night.